Hi, and welcome to the last module of this Pluralsight course named Practical HTML5. My name is Gilles Kleren and you can follow me on Twitter via @GilesKleren. In Module 6 we have discussed both support for audio and video in HTML5 as well as adding rich graphics using the canvas. As we have seen there, the canvas is capable of quite a lot of interesting features. However, it is pixel based, which means that if you want to make your graphics scale out, it'll be a manual job for you to do. If you are after scalable graphics for your site, you can take a look at SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. SVG is the focus of this last module. As said, this module focuses entirely on SVG. We'll start first with the exploration of the SVG feature and we'll add some SVG graphics to our site. Next, we'll take a look at the support for animations in SVG. So at the end of this chapter, we'll have added more graphical aspects to our site. In the previous module, as you remember, we have created a bar chart using the canvas. In this chapter, we'll add a bar chart as well, but this time using SVG. And next we'll add some animations in this bar chart as well, of course again using SVG. So let's now start the chapter with the exploration of SVG. In this first part, we'll take a look at the most important aspects of this HTML5 feature. Now before we do so, let's first get a clear picture of what SVG really is. As mentioned, SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. The name gives away what the most important aspect of SVG really is. We are working with scalable graphics. Now to have scalable graphics, we cannot work with pixels, with bitmaps that is. Instead, what we need are vectors. An SVG graphic doesn't really contain pixels. It contains instructions that allow the browser to create the drawing for you. Since we're working with instructions, things can be rolled back, as it is the browser who is constantly updating the drawing for you. Of course, we don't work with these instructions ourselves. To create SVG graphics, we work with an abstraction. SVG is an XML-based language. All the graphics are created declaratively. It is therefore comparable with XAML. SVG has its own DOM, and we'll see that soon. Indeed, SVG blocks are declarations in a separate DOM within the main HTML DOM. In the small sample code here on the left of the slide, we see an HTML DOM, and inside it we see a separate SVG DOM. A page can of course contain more than one single SVG DOM. The SVG DOM itself is not an island, as it interacts with the surrounding HTML. It's perfectly possible to include graphics as well as animations in the SVG DOM. SVG is part of HTML5 and is now an official W3C recommendation. If you've been a web developer for quite some years, you may remember that SVG isn't really new. It was already created in 2001 but has never really taken off. Now being part of HTML5, there's much better browser support for it. Most features we'll discuss in this chapter are compatible with all major browsers. On this slide here, we see again the very small sample we saw in the previous slide already. The sample contains an HTML DOM, and inside it you can see an SVG block. As mentioned, this is the SVG DOM declaration. Inside the SVG element, we are going to build up our SVG content. The SVG itself is part of the layout of the page and therefore gets a width and a height. Now what can we place inside the SVG element then? Well, we'll start, just like with the canvas, with some basic shapes, which are really easy to create. There's a similar list of basic shapes available. If we want to create, for example, a rectangle, we use the rect element. In the code sample you see here, we see that within the SVG block, a rectangle is being created and it is placed on coordinates 10, 10. It also gets a width of 100 and a height of 100. Similarly, we can create a circle, for which we have to declare a center point as well as a radius. An ellipse declaration also requires that we create a center point as well as a radius in the X and in the Y direction. We can also create a polygon, which is a closed shape for which we can declare the points as you see here. A line can be declared with 2 points, whereas a polyline is a collection of points. If we need to create a complex shape, we probably won't get there with the above elements and probably need to use a path. Paths are very complex to create by hand and therefore are often created using a drawing tool. Finally, we can also add text using the text element. To add text, we need to specify where the text needs to be placed using the X and Y coordinates. Between the open and close tags, we then specify the actual text. In the following slides, I'm going to give you some more examples of SVG graphics with some more code. On this slide here, we can see the complete listing, including the HTML DOM to create a red rectangle you see here on the slide. So the SVG block is declared within the body of the HTML DOM. And inside the SVG block, we have a rect declaration, including the red fill color. Notice we also have a fallback declared inside of the SVG block, so we can notify users that they are using a browser which does not support SVG. In this sample here, we have a couple of ellipses. Although you could think there's some special effect going on here, the image that you see here can be created using 3 simple ellipses. Notice indeed, inside of the SVG element, we have 3 ellipse elements being added. Each has its center and radius in both horizontal and vertical axes defined. We can also create a more complex shape using a polyline. As mentioned, the polyline is a collection of points. In the code here, we see the points for the polyline declared in the points attribute. SVG can also fill the created shape, as you see here in this image. By default, it will fill the created shape with the black color. We can, of course, with SVG go further than just adding a couple of rectangles or ellipses on screen. We have quite a few formatting options available to us. For example, we can change the way a simple line is shown on the screen. We can change the stroke width, the line cap and the dash array. In the sample code you see here on the screen, we have created a dashed line. The line uses dashes of 10-10, meaning 10 pixels are blue and 10 pixels are transparent. Also, we have added a line cap and set it to round. We can of course go a bit further and make a more complex dash array, as you can see here in the second sample. Notice that we have created a different dash array in the code. Also, things like the basic rectangle can be formatted differently. For example, the rect element exposes the fill as well as the fill opacity. The fill accepts a color and the fill opacity accepts a value between 0 and 1. The lower the value, the more transparent the shape will become. Now, SVG also supports grouping of elements. For this, we have the G element. In the sample here, we can see that we have a G element around a couple of other elements. When we group elements, we can apply a style on all elements of the group in one go. It's possible also to nest groups for even more control. Now, SVG has more advanced effects we can apply on its elements. For this, we can use filters. As the word filter implies, using a filter we can apply one or more graphical changes on an SVG element. SVG comes out of the box with a number of predefined filters. So how do we apply such a filter? Now, filters are declared in a so-called defs block. Defs contain definitions of resources, which will be referenced from elsewhere in the code. This way, the filter can be defined once and used multiple times inside the page. In the sample you see here on the slide, we have a defs block at the top, and inside of it, we have a filter being declared. Notice that the filter does have an ID defined. That's required. In this slide, we don't have an actual filter added yet. We'll add it in just a second. Secondly, we have a rect element. And on that rect, we are going to use the filter attribute. And as the value, we specify a URL and then the ID of the filter within the defs block. And that filter will then be applied on the rect element. Like I said, there are a couple of filters built into SVG. You can see the list here. Of course, we don't have the time to look at all of them in detail, so let's pick out a couple of interesting ones to apply to our rectangle. A blur, more specifically a Gaussian blur, can be applied on an SVG element using a filter. You can see the end result on the right here in this slide. So how do we create that blurred rectangle then? Take a look at the code and you'll see again at the top of the SVG block the defs element, within there the filter declaration. We specify that we want to apply a Gaussian blur using the FE Gaussian blur filter. Filters have attributes as well. The deviation parameter influences how blurry the image will be made. And on the rect element, we are applying the filter using the filter attribute again, passing in the name of the filter, so the ID attribute. Now, one filter can be the combination of several effects. For example, we can create a drop shadow. Now, there is no built-in effect for this. However, we can combine a couple of other effects together, so basically we're chaining the effects. Take a look at the code here and notice that we have a filter within there, an FE offset, FE Gaussian blur, and FE blend. FE offset is used first and basically offsets the original image over a certain distance. The output of FE offset serves as the input for the blur effect. And the blur is then added, and thirdly, the output of the blur effect is used as the input for the FE blend. The latter will blend the original image and the offset image. That is the one with the blur effect applied on it. Now we've already seen solid fills that we can use to color an element. Next to solid fills, SVG also supports gradients to use as fill style for elements such as rectangles. More specifically, SVG supports linear gradients as well as radial gradients. One thing before we look at them in code, just like filters, gradients are defined inside of a defs block, so they can be reused multiple times within the SVG DOM. Let's apply a linear gradient. On this slide here, we are creating a gradient to fill an ellipse. The gradient we are creating here is a horizontal gradient, starting on the left and continuing to the right, so the default. First, take a look at the defs block, where we are defining the gradient using the linear gradient element. We're first giving it an ID, and next we define the direction using the x and y values. For these values, a percentage is expected. Notice that the x value goes from 0 to 100%, which is why we are creating a linear horizontal gradient. Next, we define the color stops, and for each stop, we need to specify where, so at which percentage the color should be visible in full. Finally, we then apply the gradient on the style using the fill property, which now points to the ID of the gradient. If you want the gradient to be vertical, we simply have to specify that the value varies in the y direction, as you can see here in the sample. Let us now turn our attention again to the coffee store site and add some SVG code. In the previous demo, we have created this bar chart using a canvas. And in this last module, we're looking at SVG, and we're going to try to recreate this same bar chart, but now with SVG. Let's take a look. So in this case, we're not going to be using any JavaScript. We're going to create the entire bar chart in a declarative manner. So we're going to start by creating the SVG block in which we are going to create our chart. So I've added this SVG DOM within the main DOM of our page. One of the first things that we did with the canvas was creating our axis, and now we're going to do exactly the same. In a declarative way, I'm going to add two lines here, which are going to be the actual axis. The parameters are the starting point, the end point, the stroke, which is in this case black, and the stroke width. With the axis in place, I'm going to create a bar for the bar chart. Now, such a bar is indeed a rectangle with, again, a starting point, a height, a width, and a fill. All the other bars are pretty similar. I'm going to paste them in here. As you can see, now I've added 12 rectangles. If you remember, in the canvas, we also had some labels on our chart. We're going to do that here as well. If you remember correctly, in the canvas bar chart, we had some labels at the bottom of the bar chart. We're going to do that here as well, and we're going to use the text element for that. Such a text element also gets a position where it needs to create the actual text, a fill, and then the actual content. And in a similar manner, we can add all other labels for all other months. We're going to add some more labels here. Now, these labels actually display the value of the bar chart, so the number of sales of that particular coffee for each month inside of the chart. Let's take a look at the resulting bar chart. So this is the canvas one, and this is the one that we just created now using SVG. As you can see, I've actually not added 12 bar charts, I've only added 11. We're going to add the 12th one in the next demo.